The bullet grazed Tessa Rayburn's shoulder the same moment she realized the cattle rustlers had them surrounded. And in that split second before the pain registered, she saw Xavier Harding throw himself between her and the next shot. They hit the ground together behind the overturned wagon, his body covering hers, his breath hot against her ear as he whispered words she couldn't quite hear over the thunder of gunfire. That was 3 years ago, back when she'd first arrived in Butte, Montana, with nothing but a stubborn streak and a dead father's dream of building the finest ranch this side of the Rockies. Xavier had been the foreman then, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer storm, and he'd looked at her like she was crazy when she'd announced her intentions to run the whole operation herself. The year was 1884, and women didn't typically manage cattle ranches, but Tessa had never been typical. Her father had raised her to ride, rope, and shoot as well as any man, and when he died suddenly of a heart attack just weeks before they were supposed to make the move west together, she'd loaded up the wagon and made the journey alone. The ranch had been in rough shape when she'd arrived, the previous owner having drunk himself into an early grave, but the land was good and the price was right. Xavier had stayed on when she'd offered him a fair wage and a promise that she'd work just as hard as any hand on the place. She'd kept that promise. For 5 years now, they'd worked side by side from dawn until dusk, mending fences, breaking horses, driving cattle to market. Xavier never treated her like she was fragile or incapable, never suggested she should be inside doing needlework instead of out riding the range. He taught her how to read the weather, how to spot a sick cow before it could infect the herd, how to negotiate with the hard-nosed buyers who came through but looking to take advantage of anyone they perceived as weak. In return, she'd trusted him with every decision, valued his opinion above all others, and somewhere along the way, she'd started noticing things she probably shouldn't have noticed, like the way his hands looked when he rolled up his sleeves to work, all strength and certainty. Like the sound of his laugh, rare but genuine, that made something warm unfold in her chest. Like how he always made sure she ate when they were out on the range for days at a time, even if it meant he went with less. She'd told herself it didn't mean anything, that he was just a good man doing his job, that she couldn't afford to let her heart get tangled up in something that would complicate the only life she'd managed to build for herself. The ranch hands respected Xavier, and by extension, they respected her. There were 8 of them now, good men who worked hard and didn't ask questions about why a woman was giving the orders. They had their own bunkhouse, and Tessa lived in the main ranch house alone, which had seemed practical at first, but had started to feel increasingly lonely as the years wore on. Sometimes she'd see Xavier watching her from across the corral with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she'd wonder if he ever felt the same gnawing emptiness she did when she climbed into her bed at night. Today had started like any other spring morning in Montana, with the sun rising over the mountains and turning everything gold and purple. They were preparing for the spring roundup, which meant long days in the saddle and even longer nights planning the logistics of moving several hundred head of cattle to better grazing land. Tessa had been in the barn checking on a mare that was due to foal any day when Xavier had walked in, his hat in his hands, his face serious. "We need to talk," he'd said, and something in his tone made her stomach drop. "About the roundup?" she'd asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No." "About us." Those 2 words had hung in the air between them like a thundercloud, heavy with possibility and danger. Tessa had busied herself with adjusting the mare's blanket, her hands suddenly unsteady. "There is no us, Xavier. There's the ranch and there's the work." Tessa. Her name in his mouth sounded different than when anyone else said it, softer somehow despite his rough voice. Look at me. She turned slowly, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. Xavier had taken a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I can't do this anymore," he'd said, and for one terrible moment she'd thought he was quitting, thought he was leaving her. The panic must have shown on her face because he'd reached out instinctively, his hand closing around her upper arm. "No, I don't mean the ranch. I mean this, pretending I don't feel what I feel. Tessa, I've been in love with you since the day you climbed down from that wagon covered in trail dust and told me you were going to make this place something special. I've loved you through every dawn we've watched together, every meal we've shared, every moment you've trusted me with something important. I've loved you when you're tired and cranky, when you're celebrating a good sale, when you're grieving something lost. I've loved you the whole damn time, and I can't keep it locked up inside anymore." The words had rushed over her like a flash flood, sweeping away every careful barrier she'd constructed around her heart. She'd opened her mouth to respond, but no sound had come out. Xavier had continued, his grip on her arm gentle but firm, as though he needed the physical connection to say what he'd been holding back for so long. "I know this complicates things. I know you've worked hard to build something here and you don't need some cowboy messing it up with feelings. If you want me to pack my things and go, I'll do it. But I had to tell you. I couldn't spend another day working beside you, watching you, wanting you without you knowing the truth." Tessa had found her voice then, though it came out barely above a whisper. "You think I'd send you away? I don't know what to think. You've got walls built up higher than any fence on this ranch. Maybe I built them because I was afraid," she'd admitted. "Afraid that if I let myself want something more than this ranch, more than just survival, it would all fall apart. Everything I've ever loved has been taken from me, Xavier. My mother when I was 10, my father right when we were supposed to start this life together. I couldn't bear it if I let myself love you and then lost you too." His eyes had widened, and she'd realized what she'd just said. The confession had slipped out without her permission, but now that it was in the open, she couldn't take it back. Didn't want to take it back. "You love me." Xavier's voice had been rough with emotion. "I've been in love with you for so long I can't remember when it started," Tessa had said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "Maybe it was that day with the rustlers when you threw yourself in front of a bullet for me. Maybe it was the first winter when you sat up 3 nights in a row with me helping a sick calf survive. Maybe it was every single moment in between. I love the way you never doubted I could do this. I love how you smell like leather and sage. I love your hands, your voice, the way you always make sure I'm safe even though you know I can handle myself. I love you, Xavier Harding, and it terrifies me." He'd closed the remaining distance between them then, his free hand coming up to cup her face. "I'm not going anywhere, Tessa. I've spent 5 years proving I'm here for the long haul. I'll spend 50 more if that's what it takes for you to believe it." When he'd kissed her, it had felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. His lips had been gentle at first, asking a question, and when she'd answered by winding her arms around his neck, the kiss had deepened into something that made her knees weak. She'd kissed him back with 5 years of longing, tasting the coffee he'd drunk that morning and something uniquely him, feeling the rasp of his stubble against her skin, and not caring one bit. His arms had wrapped around her waist, pulling her close, and for the first time in her life, Tessa had felt truly safe, truly cherished, truly home when they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard. Xavier had rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he'd said. "I want to court you proper, take you to the church social, let everyone in but know you're spoken for. Everyone already thinks I'm your woman, Tessa had said with a small laugh. "I've heard the talk in town. Let them think what they want. I want them to know for certain." That had been 2 months ago, and true to his word, Xavier had courted her with an old-fashioned determination that had made her fall even deeper in love with him. He'd started taking meals in the main house instead of the bunkhouse, and they'd sit together at her kitchen table talking about everything under the sun. He'd brought her wildflowers from the meadow, taught her to dance in the parlor by lamplight, read poetry to her in his rumbling voice even though he claimed he wasn't good with fancy words. They'd gone to the church social together, and while there had been some raised eyebrows at the ranch owner courting her foreman, most folks in Butte had just nodded like they'd been expecting it all along. The other ranch hands had adjusted quickly, especially when it became clear that Xavier and Tessa still ran the operation with the same efficiency they always had. If anything, the ranch seemed to thrive more than ever. The spring roundup had gone smoothly. The new calves were healthy and strong, and they'd struck a favorable deal with a buyer from Denver who wanted to make it a regular arrangement. Tessa found that having Xavier's love didn't make her weaker or more distracted like she'd feared. Instead, it made her stronger, more confident, more willing to take the risks that led to greater rewards. But with the joy came vulnerability, and vulnerability meant fear. Every time Xavier rode out to check the far pastures, Tessa would find herself holding her breath until he returned. Every time there was trouble, whether it was a mountain lion near the herd or a disagreement with a neighboring rancher over water rights, she'd feel that old terror trying to claw its way up from her chest. Xavier seemed to sense it, and he'd taken to leaving her little notes when he had to be gone for more than a few hours, reminders that he'd be back, that he wasn't going anywhere, that she couldn't get rid of him even if she tried. Summer arrived with its long, hot days and clear Montana skies. They moved the cattle to the higher pastures where the grass was still green and lush, and Tessa and Xavier would sometimes stay overnight in the line shack, a small cabin on the edge of the property. Those nights were her favorite, when it was just the two of them and the vast wilderness, when they could talk until the stars came out and fall asleep in each other's arms without worrying about propriety, or what anyone might think. Xavier had been careful to respect her reputation, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but the desire between them was a living thing, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening in late July, they were sitting on the porch of the line shack watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Xavier had his arm around her shoulders, and Tessa was leaning into his warmth, feeling more content than she'd ever imagined possible. "Marry me," Xavier said suddenly, and Tessa's breath caught in her throat. She pulled back to look at him, searching his face for any sign of jest, but his expression was completely serious. "What? Marry me, Tessa Rayburn. Let me be your husband, not just your foreman. Let me wake up next to you every morning for the rest of our lives. Let me build a life with you, a real life, not just one we're stealing in moments between work." "Xavier, she paused, her heart racing. "Are you sure? Being married to a woman who runs a ranch isn't exactly a traditional life." "When have I ever wanted traditional?" He took both her hands in his. "I want you. I want this life we've built together. I want to make it official before God and everyone in Montana. I want babies with your stubborn streak in my eyes. I want to grow old with you, sitting on a porch just like this one, watching our grandchildren run through the fields. Say yes, Tessa. Please say yes." Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes. Yes, of course yes. I'll marry you, Xavier Harding." He'd kissed her then, deep and passionate, and when he'd picked her up and carried her inside the cabin, she hadn't protested. That night, under the quilts in the small bed, They'd made love for the first time, and Tessa had finally understood what it meant to give yourself to someone completely, to trust them with not just your heart but your body and soul. Xavier had been gentle and patient, making sure she felt cherished and safe, and afterward, as they'd lain tangled together in the darkness, Tessa had felt a peace settle over her that she'd never known before. "I love you," she'd whispered against his chest. "I love you too," he'd replied, his arms tightening around her. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." They'd ridden back to the ranch the next morning, and Tessa had immediately started planning the wedding. She wanted something simple but meaningful, just their close friends and the ranch hands who'd become like family. The local preacher agreed to perform the ceremony in early September, after the summer work was done but before the weather turned. Tessa had written to her aunt in Boston, her only living relative, to share the news, and the woman had sent back a warm letter of congratulations along with her grandmother's wedding ring, a simple gold band that Tessa treasured. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity. They had to finish repairing the barn roof before winter, make sure the cattle were all accounted for and properly branded, and negotiate with the bank for a loan to expand the ranch. Xavier had ideas about buying the adjacent property, which had recently come up for sale, and Tessa had to admit the additional grazing land would give them room to grow the herd significantly. They'd sat down together and gone over the numbers, and eventually decided to take the risk. If they were building a life together, they might as well build something that would last. The other ranch hands had taken the news of the engagement with enthusiastic support. They'd known for months that Xavier and Tessa were courting, and most of them had confided that they thought it was about time the two of them made it official. Several of them had offered to help with the wedding preparations, and before Tessa knew it, they were building a platform in front of the barn for the ceremony and stringing up lanterns for the celebration afterward. Tessa had gone into Butt to buy fabric for a dress, and Mrs. Henderson at the general store had insisted on helping her pick out something appropriate. They'd settled on a beautiful cream-colored silk with delicate lace trim, and Mrs. Henderson had promised to have it sewn up in time for the wedding. It wasn't the elaborate gown a wealthy bride might wear, but it was more than Tessa had ever imagined she'd have. And when she'd tried it on for the final fitting, she'd felt like the most fortunate woman alive. Xavier had been busy with his own preparations, though he'd been more secretive about them. Tessa would catch him talking quietly with some of the hands, and when she'd ask what they were planning, he'd just give her a mysterious smile and say it was a surprise. She'd learned to trust him implicitly over the years, so she'd let it go, focusing instead on making sure everything else was ready. The night before the wedding, tradition dictated they shouldn't see each other, so Xavier had bunked in with the other hands while Tessa stayed in the main house. She'd lain awake for hours, too excited and nervous to sleep, thinking about how much her life had changed since she'd first arrived in Butt. She'd come here alone and afraid, determined to prove she could make it on her own, and instead, she'd found a partner who made her stronger, braver, and infinitely happier. Tomorrow she'd become Mrs. Xavier Harding, and the thought filled her with a joy so intense it was almost painful. The morning of September 15th, 1884, dawned clear and beautiful. Tessa was up before sunrise, too keyed up to stay in bed. She'd bathed and washed her hair, then carefully put on the cream silk dress, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened the tiny buttons. Mrs. Henderson had delivered the dress along with a simple veil made of lace, and when Tessa had looked at herself in the mirror, she'd hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked happy, truly happy, in a way she'd never seen in her own reflection before. The ceremony was set for late morning, when the sun would be high but the day wouldn't be too hot yet. As Tessa walked out to the platform that had been built in front of the barn, she was amazed at what the hands had accomplished. White ribbons were tied to every post, wildflowers decorated every available surface, and benches had been set up for the guests. It looked magical, like something out of a storybook, and Tessa felt tears prick her eyes at the care everyone had taken. Then she saw Xavier waiting for her at the platform, and everything else faded away. He was wearing a new suit, black with a crisp white shirt, and his hair was neatly combed for once. But it was the expression on his face that stole her breath, a look of such pure love and devotion that she felt it in her bones. He was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he couldn't believe his good fortune, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. The ranch hands and townspeople who'd gathered all turned to watch as Tessa made her way down the aisle. She'd had no one to walk her down since her father was gone, but she held her head high and walked confidently toward the man she loved. When she reached Xavier, he took her hands in his, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was just as nervous and excited as she was. The preacher began the ceremony, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Tessa barely heard the words, too focused on Xavier's face, on the way his eyes never left hers, on the small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When it came time for the vows, Xavier's voice was strong and clear. I, Xavier Harding, take you, Tessa Rayburn, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand beside you through whatever life brings. I promise to be your partner in all things, to respect your strength and support you when you need it. I promise to make you laugh, to keep you safe, and to remind you every day how much you mean to me. I promise to build a life with you that's worthy of the love we share. These promises I make before God and these witnesses, and I'll keep them until my last breath. Tessa's voice shook slightly as she said her own vows, but the words came straight from her heart. I, Tessa Rayburn, take you, Xavier Harding, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, trust you, and walk beside you through all of life's adventures. I promise to be your partner in building our dreams, to value your wisdom and stand with you in difficult times. I promise to cherish the life we've created together, to give you my heart completely, and to never take for granted the gift of your love. These promises I make before God and these witnesses, and I'll honor them for the rest of my days. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and when Xavier kissed her, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Tessa kissed him back, pouring all her love and hope and joy into that moment, and when they finally broke apart, she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. The celebration that followed was the finest party Montana had ever seen. Tables had been set up with food that the townspeople had brought, and someone had brought a fiddle and a guitar for music. Xavier led Tessa in the first dance, holding her close and whispering in her ear about how beautiful she looked, how lucky he was, how he couldn't wait to start their life together. They danced until the sun began to set, and then Xavier had led her away from the party, promising he had something to show her. He'd taken her to the main house, and when he'd opened the door, Tessa had gasped. The entire interior had been transformed. New curtains hung in the windows, a beautiful quilt covered the bed in what had been her room but was now theirs, and fresh paint brightened the walls. Flowers filled every vase, and candles had been lit throughout the house, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. How did you do all this? Tessa had asked, her voice full of wonder. The boys helped while you were in town these past few weeks, Xavier had admitted. I wanted our home to feel new, like we were starting fresh together. Do you like it? I love it. I love you. She'd turned to face him, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. Thank you, Xavier. For all of this, for everything, for loving me even when I was too scared to admit I loved you back." He'd kissed her softly, then swept her up in his arms and carried her to their bedroom. That night, as man and wife, they'd made love with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. Afterward, lying in Xavier's arms in their marriage bed, Tessa had felt the last of her fear finally release its grip on her heart. She was his, he was hers, and nothing would ever change that. The first year of their marriage flew by in a blur of joy and hard work. They'd successfully purchased the adjacent property, nearly doubling the size of their ranch, and hired 3 more hands to help manage the expanded operation. The cattle herd had grown, and they'd started breeding horses as well, which proved to be quite profitable. Tessa and Xavier worked together seamlessly, each knowing instinctively what the other needed, their partnership stronger than ever now that it was backed by the bond of marriage. But the greatest joy came in the spring of 1885, when Tessa discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but she'd waited to tell Xavier until she was certain. When she'd finally shared the news over dinner one evening, his reaction had been everything she'd hoped for. He'd shouted with joy, picked her up and spun her around despite her protests, then set her down gently like she was made of glass. "We're going to have a baby," he'd kept repeating, his hands on her still flat stomach, his face split in the biggest grin she'd ever seen. "You're going to be a mother, I'm going to be a father. Tessa, this is the best news I've ever gotten." "Better than when I agreed to marry you," she'd teased. "Well, maybe tied for best news," he'd amended, and they'd both laughed. Xavier had been impossibly protective during her pregnancy, constantly worried that she was working too hard or not eating enough or pushing herself too much. Tessa had found it endearing even when it was annoying, and she'd learned to let him fuss over her because she knew it came from a place of love. The other ranch hands had been equally excited about the impending arrival, already taking bets on whether it would be a boy or girl and arguing about who would get to teach the child to ride. The baby had arrived in early December, during the first real snowstorm of the winter. The labor had been long and difficult, and Xavier had refused to leave her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she'd cursed him for getting her into this situation in the first place. When their son had finally been born, red-faced and screaming lustily, Xavier had cried openly, cradling the tiny infant in his large, work-roughened hands like he was the most delicate thing in existence. They'd named him Thomas Robert Harding, after both of their fathers, and from the moment Tessa had held him, she'd understood a kind of love she'd never known existed. This tiny person was part of her and part of Xavier, the physical embodiment of their love, and she'd never felt more complete. Watching Xavier with their son was a revelation. He was gentle and patient, singing old cowboy songs in his rumbling voice to get Thomas to sleep, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor for hours when the baby was fussy. He was a natural father, and Tessa fell even more in love with him seeing him in this new role. The winter of 1885 was harsh, but they were snug in their home with their new son, and Tessa had never been happier. The ranch was thriving. Her marriage was everything she dreamed it could be, and now they had a child to raise and love. Sometimes she'd lie awake at night, listening to Xavier's steady breathing on one side and Thomas's little snuffles from the cradle on the other, and she'd marvel at how much her life had changed. The lonely, frightened woman who'd arrived in but 5 years ago seemed like a different person entirely. As Thomas grew from an infant into a toddler, he proved to be a perfect mix of both his parents. He had Xavier's gray eyes and Tessa's dark hair, Xavier's easy smile and Tessa's stubborn determination. By the time he was 2, He was already following his father around the ranch, his little legs working double time to keep up with Xavier's long stride. Xavier would hoist him up onto his shoulders and carry him while he did the rounds, pointing out the horses and cattle, teaching him the names of everything they passed. Tessa would watch them together and feel her heart swell with so much love she thought it might burst. In the summer of 1887, Tessa discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was less of a shock and more of a warm glow of happiness. She told Xavier while they were out riding together, just the two of them, having stolen a rare afternoon away from the ranch. They'd stopped by a stream to let the horses drink, and Tessa had turned to him and simply said, "We're going to have another baby." Xavier's face had lit up with that same joy she'd seen when she'd told him about Thomas. He'd pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly before dropping to his knees and pressing his ear to her stomach as if he could hear the baby already. "Hello in there, little one," he'd said. "Your big brother is going to be so excited to meet you." Their daughter had been born in February of 1888, arriving much faster than Thomas had, as if she was in a hurry to join the family. They'd named her Margaret Rose, but from the beginning, everyone called her Maggie. She had Tessa's green eyes and Xavier's light brown hair, and from birth, she'd had a loud, demanding personality that kept them all on their toes. Thomas had been fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Xavier had been completely wrapped around her tiny finger from day one. Watching Xavier with their daughter had made Tessa fall in love with him all over again. He was somehow even more gentle with Maggie than he'd been with Thomas, holding her like she was made of spun sugar, singing to her, telling her stories. As she grew, he taught her to ride just as he had Thomas, never once suggesting that she couldn't do something because she was a girl. Tessa appreciated that more than she could say, knowing that her daughter would grow up understanding that her gender didn't limit her dreams. The ranch continued to prosper through the years. By 1890, they were one of the most successful operations in Montana, known for their quality cattle and fine horses. They'd built a new barn, expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, and established relationships with buyers all across the West. Tessa and Xavier still worked side by side every day, though Xavier had taken on more of the physical labor as Tessa focused increasingly on the business side of things. They made a formidable team, respected by everyone in Butte and the surrounding territories. Thomas, now 5 years old, was already showing signs of being a natural rancher. He had his father's way with animals and his mother's head for business, asking questions about everything and absorbing information like a sponge. Maggie, at 2, was fearless and adventurous, climbing everything she could reach and giving her parents heart attacks on a regular basis. Xavier would joke that she'd inherited Tessa's stubborn streak ×2, and Tessa couldn't really argue with that assessment. On their 6th wedding anniversary, Xavier had surprised Tessa by planning a special evening. He'd arranged for Mrs. Henderson from town to watch the children, and he'd taken Tessa out to the line shack, where they'd spent so many nights early in their relationship. He'd set up a beautiful dinner, complete with candles and wildflowers, and they'd eaten and talked and laughed like they were courting again. As the sun had set, turning the Montana sky into a masterpiece of color, Xavier had taken Tessa's hand. "Do you remember when I first told you I loved you?" He'd asked. "Right here in this cabin 6 years ago." "I remember everything about that day," Tessa had replied softly. "I remember being terrified and thrilled all at once. I remember thinking my life was about to change forever. Has it been everything you hoped?" Xavier's voice had been uncharacteristically uncertain, and Tessa had realized he genuinely needed to know. She'd shifted closer to him, taking his face in her hands so he could see the truth in her eyes. "It's been better than I could have ever hoped. Xavier, you gave me everything I never knew I wanted. Not just the ranch or the success, but a home, a family, a love that makes every day better than the last. You've never once made me feel like I had to be anything other than who I am. You've celebrated my strength and held me through my weaknesses. You've been my partner in every sense of the word. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. That's the kind of love we have, the kind that just keeps growing." Xavier had kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. "I spent 5 years working beside you, falling more in love with you every day, before I found the courage to tell you how I felt. Best decision I ever made. Second best was asking you to marry me. Third best was every morning I've woken up next to you since then." They'd made love that night in the line shack, and it had been just as passionate and tender as it had been that first time, proof that the fire between them hadn't dimmed with time or familiarity. Afterward, as they'd lain tangled together under the quilts, Tessa had felt the same profound contentment she'd felt on their wedding night, only deeper, richer, more certain. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated good years and struggled through lean ones, but they did it all together. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did, and Maggie remained spirited and independent, already announcing at age 5 that she was going to run the whole ranch herself someday. Xavier and Tessa would exchange amused glances over her pronouncements, both silently acknowledging that she probably would. In 1893, Tessa discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise since she was now 34 and had assumed their family was complete. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two, and Xavier had been even more protective, insisting she rest more and work less. She'd grumbled about it but secretly appreciated his concern. Their second son had been born in October of that year, a quiet baby who rarely cried and seemed content to simply observe the world around him. They'd named him Daniel James, and from the beginning, it was clear he had a different temperament than his siblings, more thoughtful and introspective. Xavier had taken to fatherhood for the third time with the same joy and dedication he'd shown with the first 2 children. At 37, he still looked much the same as he had when Tessa had first met him, though there were now threads of gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun for so many years. Tessa thought he'd never looked more handsome, and she'd told him so regularly, much to his embarrassed pleasure. As the century turned, and Montana moved toward the new era of the 1900s, the ranch continued to evolve. Thomas, now 15, had taken on significant responsibilities, working alongside his father and learning everything there was to know about running the operation. Maggie, at 12, was an accomplished rider and had started helping train the younger horses, showing a natural talent for it. Even young Daniel, at 7, was already showing interest in the business side of things, asking his mother endless questions about accounts and contracts. Tessa and Xavier would sometimes sit on the porch in the evenings, watching their children play in the yard and marvel at what they'd built together. It wasn't just the ranch, though that was certainly an achievement to be proud of. It was the family they'd created, the love they'd nurtured, the life they'd chosen together. They'd started as employer and employee, become friends and partners, fallen in love, and built something that would last long after they were gone. "You ever regret it?" Tessa had asked one evening, her head on Xavier's shoulder as they watched the sunset. "Admitting you loved me, taking the risk of changing everything." Xavier had been quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "The only thing I regret is all the time I wasted being afraid to tell you. I should have said something sooner. We could have had more years together." "We have plenty of years ahead of us still," Tessa had said firmly. "And besides, maybe we needed that time working side by side to build the foundation. Maybe we wouldn't have appreciated what we have if we'd rushed into it." "Maybe," Xavier had agreed. "But I knew from day one, Tessa. I knew you were the woman I was going to spend my life with. I just had to wait for you to be ready to hear it." "And I'm so glad you waited," Tessa had said softly. "I'm so glad you were patient with me, that you didn't give up even when I had walls built so high around my heart. You taught me that love doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger." "We make each other stronger," Xavier had corrected. "That's what partnership means." As the years continued to unfold, their partnership only deepened. They faced the challenges of the new century together, adapting to changes in the cattle industry, dealing with new regulations and competitors, expanding and evolving as necessary. Thomas eventually married a sweet young woman named Elizabeth from one of the neighboring ranches, and they gave Xavier and Tessa their first grandchild in 1905, a little girl they named Sarah. The joy of becoming grandparents had been unexpected and profound, and Xavier had been just as smitten with his granddaughter as he'd been with his own children. Maggie had eventually taken over the horse training operation, expanding it into a profitable business of its own. She'd proven to have her mother's head for business and her father's way with animals, and buyers came from all over Montana to purchase horses trained by Maggie Harding. She'd married at 25 to a man who respected her independence and supported her dreams, and they'd built a house on the far end of the ranch property, keeping the family close. Daniel had surprised everyone by developing an interest in the law, and after much discussion, Xavier and Tessa had supported his dream of going to university in Helena. He'd come home with a law degree and set up a practice in Butte, specializing in land and water rights, and he'd proven invaluable in helping his parents and other ranchers navigate the increasingly complex legal landscape. Through it all, through every milestone and memory, Xavier and Tessa remained each other's constant. They still worked together every day, though their pace had slowed as they moved into their 50s and then their 60s. The ranch was now primarily managed by Thomas and his family, with Maggie handling the horse operation and Daniel providing legal counsel. Xavier and Tessa had earned the right to slow down, to spend more time on the porch watching the grandchildren play, to take rides together just for the pleasure of it rather than out of necessity. On the morning of September 15, 1914, Tessa woke to find Xavier already awake, watching her with that same look of love and wonder he'd had on their wedding day 30 years earlier. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Harding," he'd said, his voice rough with age but still strong. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Harding," she'd replied, reaching up to touch his face, now deeply lined but still handsome to her eyes. 30 years. Can you believe it? Best 30 years of my life," Xavier had said firmly. "And you know what? I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat." Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it led to this, to us, to the family we've built. I spent 5 years working beside you, loving you in secret, before I finally found the courage to tell you the truth, and every day since then has been a gift. Tessa had felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "You gave me everything, Xavier. You gave me love when I was afraid to accept it. You gave me children when I didn't think I could have them. You gave me a partnership that made me stronger and braver. You gave me a life beyond anything I imagined when I first came to Butte all those years ago." "We gave each other everything," Xavier had corrected gently, wiping away her tears with his thumb. That's what love is, Tessa. It's two people choosing each other every single day, no matter what. And I choose you today just as surely as I chose you 30 years ago. They'd celebrated their anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren, with half of Butt turning out to honor the couple who'd built not just a successful ranch, but a true legacy. There was food and music and dancing, and when Xavier had taken Tessa in his arms for their anniversary dance, it had felt just like that first dance at their wedding, full of promise and joy and unwavering love. As the sun set on that perfect day, Xavier and Tessa stood together on the porch of the house they'd made their home, watching their family celebrate in the yard below. 3 generations of Hardings, all because a cowboy had finally found the courage to admit he'd been in love the whole time, and a stubborn woman had finally allowed herself to love him back. "No regrets?" Xavier had asked, echoing the question Tessa had asked him so many years before. "Not a single one," Tessa had replied, leaning into his embrace. "Only gratitude for every moment we've had together and excitement for all the moments still to come." And there would be many more moments, many more years of love and laughter, of watching their grandchildren grow and welcoming great-grandchildren, of working side by side until their bodies no longer allowed it, and then of sitting side by side, hands clasped, watching the Montana sunsets they'd seen thousands of times before and finding them beautiful still. Because that's what love did. It transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, the simple into the profound. It took two people working side by side and turned them into partners, lovers, spouses, and best friends. It created something lasting and true, something that would echo through the generations long after they were gone. Xavier Harding had worked beside Tessa Rayburn for 5 years before he'd finally admitted he'd been in love with her the whole time. And in doing so, he'd set in motion a love story that would become legend in Butte, Montana, a testament to the power of patience, courage, and two hearts finally finding their way home to each other. It was a love that had weathered every storm, celebrated every triumph, and grown stronger with each passing year. It was the kind of love that made life worth living, that transformed a simple ranch into a home, that turned two individuals into an unbreakable unit. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Xavier pulled Tessa closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder, right where it belonged. They stood there in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of their family, the land they'd built their life on stretching out before them in all directions. This was their legacy, this love, this family, this life they'd created together. And it all began with a confession in a barn, with a cowboy who'd finally found the courage to speak his heart, and a woman who'd finally allowed herself to listen. It was, Tessa thought, the most perfect beginning to the most perfect life she could have ever imagined.